The objectives of tonight's webinars are to expand the understanding of managing diversity and relationship dynamics, explore options for responding more effectively to diversity tension, and devise solutions for enhancing cultural competency in the workplace. NHSC is pleased to offer continuing education units and continuing medical education credits of 1.5 hours for all disciplines participating in this webinar. To receive these hours, you must attend the full 1.5-hour session. Throughout the webinar, you will be required to respond to online poll questions to verify your attendance. Once you respond to all polls, your attendance will be noted. At the conclusion of the presentation, the operator will provide instructions on how to submit a question through the conference bridge line. There will also be an evaluation after the question and answer session. We would appreciate it if you took a few minutes to fill it out so we can continue to improve our future sessions. Thank you again for joining the 2012 NHSC webinar series. We hope you find this webinar useful in your daily efforts to provide service in your community. Now please welcome Daryl Butler.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Hope everyone is doing well. And welcome to our conference, to our webinar, I should say. I'm going tonight to talk about, as Barbara mentioned, a little thing that I like to call diversity tension. And if you kind of don't know what that means or what that is, allow me to shed a little bit of light on it in terms of put some context around it. It's that feeling of uneasiness that you get because someone that you work with may like to do things a little bit differently from the way you like to do things, or maybe it's a patient or someone that you're caring for that is rubbing you the wrong way every now and then. That one patient that maybe they walk in and like, oh my goodness, not today. And that feeling of tension can come about from a variety of differences, I should say. So that's what we're going to really focus our conversation around today, around this evening, is what is cultural competence? And I know the word is used a lot, the term is used a lot, so we're going to put a nice definition around it that helps everyone to understand what does that thing mean called cultural competence. Well, what are some of the challenges associated with cultural competence? What is that? How are my challenged? How are organizations even challenged? And as we are trying to overcome some of those challenges that inevitably comes with diversity and inclusion, what is my own individual role in creating these challenging situations, and of course then in resolving these difficult, challenging relationships and situations in the workplace context. So we'll try to keep our conversation to the workplace, to your experience of being healthcare providers. But as you'll find out, a lot of the tips and tools that we're going to talk about today, you're probably going to find out is helpful in your personal lives as well. And I may even give some examples from both perspectives to kind of hit home a bit. So let's first and foremost get right into defining what we mean by cultural competence. Like I said, I know the term is used a lot, and there are multiple definitions out there, in fact, on what cultural competence is. What we're going to do is we're going to define it in really two broad perspectives and then break it down into some subcomponents of those perspectives. The first part of cultural competence from our perspective in the innovations, our organization innovations, is that it's about cultural competence is about meeting people where they are. You may have heard this term before, but what that really means is becoming knowledgeable, acceptable, and adaptable of differences. It doesn't mean that I have to know everything there is to know about every difference or every culture that's out there. Being knowledgeable simply says I'm kind of in a continuous learning process. Acceptable simply says that even when I am experiencing differences that either I'm not aware of or differences that do make me uneasy, I'm moving myself to some level of acceptance. And in the workplace context, I think that's very important, because there may be a difference that someone is exhibiting, that might make you uneasy. However, you've still got to meet the objective of providing great patient care. And it's a matter of overcoming that moment of uneasiness so that you can accept what they're bringing to the table, meet them where they are, and meet the objective that you're there to meet. And that's where the adaptable comes in as well. Flexing sometimes our own style, not necessarily changing who we are, but simply flexing our style to meet someone else where they are. That's what we mean by meeting them where they are. And just a kind of a broad example of that is I am by nature very task oriented, but it turns out that I end up working with a number of relationship oriented people. I guess that's just the universe's way of testing my diversity and inclusion skill set. So with that in mind, I like to, get right to the task at hand, and some of my relationship-oriented colleagues would prefer to open up the meeting, open up our time together with a conversation about, what happened over the weekend. As a task-oriented person, my perspective is the weekend is done, that task is over, let's move on to today. But I get that, and that they may want to have that conversation just to kind of put the moment at ease. So I flex my style a little bit and prepare for that in fact, and engage in that conversation without looking at my watch as to say, are we done yet? So that's a little bit about what we mean by meet them where they are, and that's really showing ultimately some cultural humility, I would call it. And then the other component of cultural competence is really understanding how you show up. And how you, there's that. How you show up has two components in and of itself. How you show up in terms of the impact of your behaviors on others. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. And another thing we'll talk about in this conversation this evening is how we respond to diversity tension. So again, cultural competence, meeting people where they are. That's about them, and knowing how you show up, that's about you. So having some cultural humility towards others and truly understanding you in terms of how you're showing up at the table. So now when we're talking about cultural competency and where does this fit, the differences that we're talking about, they're really, a lot of ways in which we might be similar or different for that matter. And so in this conversation, we like to identify or at least put some context around the various ways in which we might feel different. The various ways in which we might feel different might be different, not feel different, but show up differently. Long list, but one of the things we do is we put the list into some categories. The first category that we like to use is something we call primary differences. You might see other terms for these particular differences, but primary differences are represented by things like age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or physical abilities. And if you look at that list there, the first thing that you might notice is that it is a list of differences that, for the most part, we don't have a lot of choice over. 18 was a great age. It was a long time ago, and as much as I try to show up as an 18-year-old or again, by choices, that's not going to happen. Someone's going to call me out. So, again, we don't have a lot of choice over these. These are kind of the ways in which we are. It is what it is. Another commonality about the primary differences is that we have laws around these. Laws that say we're not to discriminate around these. We have federal laws of anti-discrimination around these particular differences with all except sexual orientation. There are some individual states that have state laws around sexual orientation discrimination, but there's no federal law as of yet. So those are some things, and if you look at that list, everyone in your organization, everyone that you work with, everyone that's on this call, in fact, first and foremost, we're all included in the conversation of inclusion and cultural competence. Just looking at this first list of differences. So we all get to become part of the conversation of diversity, so to speak, simply by the primary differences. But there are some ways in which we add breadth and depth to who we are. Those primary differences don't make up all of who we are, and so we look at some additional ways, things that we may not necessarily see when we walk into the room, like many of the primary differences, but nevertheless they're part of who we are, and that makes up what we call secondary dimensions of diversity. Things like religion, spirituality, language, geography, where you live, family status, what I call marital or parental status. I just roll it up into family status, appearance, physical, educational level, work style, personal habits. All these things add breadth and depth to who we are, and we may not necessarily see them when we walk into the room, but they're part of our makeup. And then there's another segment of our differences, especially in the context of our work experiences. And that's something we call organizational diversity. Sometimes we may call it systems diversity. It's really about how we are functioning and operating inside of the organizations in which we operate. Either different departments, or my role in the organization, the function that I have. If there are unions, union environments typically will, we see some differences there. Seniority in the workplace, work experience, different locations. Sometimes if there is a satellite office, a satellite site for the main hospital, as an example, there may be some diversity challenges or tension going on between those different sites or different departments or different functions within a hospital or clinic setting, just as an example. So the reason why we really like to get a broader understanding of what we mean by differences that impact in cultural competence is, when we look at this list of differences, they have ways in which they impact us in many different aspects of our lives. Sometimes we like to use the term core identity, the ways in which I show up, the ways in which I see myself I see the world through my lenses, so to speak. And so what I like for you to do is to think about looking at this list. What are some of these differences that represent how you identify yourself? And I'm gonna draw a circle around a couple of the ones that represent what I like to call my core identity. So one of my core identities is race. Another one, I'll go ahead and I'll combine marital status and parental status, and I'll just call that family status. And another one of my core identities is, well, we'll call it personal habits. We'll fit into personal habits. So let me give you a couple of examples. In terms of race, for me, major core identity for me, I'm an African American male. When I worked in corporate America in the pharmaceutical industry, I have multiple examples in which I showed up in marketing meetings, providing a perspective of my life as an African American male. I remember we talked when we were launching our osteoporosis drug, as an example, and the conversation from the marketing department was they weren't going to focus efforts on African American women because African American women just didn't have osteoporosis at high numbers as compared to Caucasian and Asian women. And I remember having a conversation with one of my representatives at the time, who was African American as well, and we started sharing different people in her family in particular that had osteoporosis, African American women. And so we said, well, that sounds like a different story from what we were told in the launch meeting. So we started, we said, well, let's put on our lenses through our experience of being African American and see if we can have a different conversation, a different story to tell our physicians that we're calling on. And surely enough, the data that we discovered was that osteoporosis, being the rate of bone loss, the rate of bone loss does occur with African American women. at a similar rate. The difference typically is that African American women may have a longer, may have a higher bone density to begin with, and so that was a different story to have to go in and into a call for on a physician and share. I mean, it was, one story would have been, oh, doctor, the African American women in your patient population, don't worry about them and osteoporosis, so don't worry about this particular drug. Um, Another story that we came up with was, did you know that the rate of bone loss does occur in African American women, even though they start off with a higher bone density? So it's worthy of checking to make sure that that rate of bone loss is not impacting them with the end result of osteoporosis. Two different stories came up because we showed up with our core identity and put those lenses of being African American in the business setting on that business decision and got different outcomes. So that's just one example of how, in fact, regardless of what others might think, our own individual core identities will have an impact or can have an impact on our work experiences. Now, that's one example. Again, what I if you have a piece of paper, if you've already downloaded the handout, you'll see a section there that give you an opportunity to write down or circle even some of the differences that represent your own core identity. I think it's a great exercise just to kind of get a feel and understanding of how you are showing up in the lenses that you're using. So if core identities are, I would say, the things that make me tick, so to speak. There's another way in which we like to use this list, and that is to help us understand the differences that are creating a little bit of tension for us on a regular basis. We call those tension dimensions. And with tension dimensions, I'm going to show, let me see here, I'm going to change my color and I'm going to do a check mark for a few tension dimensions of mine. Let's see, tension dimension 1 is, personal habit. That's, that was a little raggedy there. There we go. So personal habits, tension dimension, one of them that's not on here probably is, it's not on here, but smoker, non-smoker, that's a big one for me. And I would say geographic, but part of that is just the travel piece for me. Now, personal habits. Why is that a tension dimension for me? Just showing you an example, and then you can identify your own tension dimensions. Tension dimension for me, personal habit, as you notice, is also one of my core identities. And then the part of my life I'm talking about there is my vegan diet. I'm a vegan by diet, not by lifestyle, but by diet. And at least three times a day, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to eat and where I'm going to go. And then when it comes to eating with colleagues, if we're going to have a staff meeting together or dinner meeting or what have you, I'm bringing that decision-making process to the table. And so I get, these moments where people say, whoa, here comes the vegan. We got to have dinner with the vegan. We got to have lunch with the vegan. Oh my goodness. I don't know if they say it, but they at least sometimes will show it in their own behaviors. And then for me as well, I'm trying to find a mainstream place that we can all eat, but where I'm going to get more than just an iceberg lettuce salad or some steamed tasteless vegetables and rice. But if I go to a vegan or veggie restaurant, I know I'm going to get a more healthier and heartier meal than I would getting pasta primavera. So as you can imagine, if anyone has worked in these situations or experienced these situations, that creates a little bit of tension for us at times. So again, just as you identified a couple of your own core identities, I'll invite you to now identify some dimensions with a check mark, or just writing down in your list if you're writing on a note, some dimensions that represent that bring you some tension, some uneasiness on a regular basis, especially that have a workplace impact. Give you a few minutes to jot those down. And we will come back to what you've listed in a moment there. And while you're working on that, let me give you a couple of other scenarios that we've heard, just to really kind of hone in on how these dimensions and cultural competency can have an absolute impact on our work experiences. So these are a couple of scenarios that we've heard about. One of them was patients in a predominantly Asian community. Their follow-up appointments were, set by the receptionist. Patients would say, yes, I can make it, and make the dates, but would often not show up for the dates. So there was a compliance challenge in terms of showing up for appointments within this particular population. And again, putting on some cultural competent lenses on the situation, one of the physicians, I believe the physician, the provider was of Asian background as well, realized that part of the challenge was that it was simply culturally polite just to say yes when asked a question, even if a particular person wasn't sure or couldn't make the appointment that was set by the receptionist. So, but again, the receptionist taking that initiative and saying, "Okay, we've got you scheduled now for this date." Da 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 da. Yes, thank you. Was the general interaction. Once this issue was clarified, and I think a different approach was utilized by the receptionist, and that approach was getting more input from the patient as opposed to giving the patient the date, getting input to find out what was the best date for the patient. The no-show rate was significantly decreased. Again, a major impact on the business because, as you know, missed appointments can have an impact on our dollars, and accountants will tell you that. But addressing it through culturally competent lenses resulted in better results for the business. Another story, I really like this story. This is a story of a nurse practitioner who was originally from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who is now working in a coal mining community. And she'd been there for a little while. And there was one particular situation where she shared with us that she was called to help deliver babies at a farm across from the clinic. When she arrived at the farm, finding out that it was actually a pygmy goat farm, it was a pygmy goat that was having multiple babies. So, I guess her first thought, I'm going to make the assumption, was I am not a veterinarian technician. I am a people nurse. But she went with it anyway. She shows some adaptability. If you go back to our definition of cultural competency, she accepted the moment and adapted to the moment and really got in there and helped out deliver the baby. And lo and behold, sometime later, I think the particular that particular situation, the family, maybe I think later on ended up losing their farm or something like that, but they gave her a pygmy goat to a baby as a gift for for her helping them out. So I don't know if anyone else has ever gotten a pygmy goat gift. I have not, but I can imagine that would be a way of her realizing, and then that was essentially the case, that she had been accepted by the community by showing her own acceptance and adaptability to a community that was very foreign to her. Some other traditions that she shared with us, if a baby had a earache, the father would pee in the ear, and she went with the approach at first of saying don't pee in the baby's ear. That wasn't working, so she just simply said, okay, if you got to pee in the ear, and then bring the baby to me so I can just make sure that the baby's okay. So again, showing that adaptability to help meet people where they are. And our final scenario is, I put this one in here because this was shared with us at one of the conferences, and it was a clinician with a history of alcoholism who had expressed some discomfort in attending the end of the year holiday party because liquor was being served at the party. And she didn't want the party to not happen. She just simply requested that she be able to excuse herself without, getting docked for pay or anything like that. And as it turned out, by not showing that level of adaptability, she was told that she would have to take a vacation day if she did not show up to the party. And as you can imagine, this particular provider was not happy with that outcome, was not happy with that suggestion, to the point that she actually, in fact, shared it sometime later at one of our conferences. So you could tell that it was still sitting with her in a moment of discomfort. And I shared that because I wanted to show you the impact, first to show when we use that level of cultural competence by meeting people where they are and understanding how we show up, and we show up differently, then we bridge the gaps and we get different outcomes. We get more positive outcomes. We get highly impactful outcomes. When we don't show that level of cultural competence and meet people where they are and show some adaptability and get confused on the requirements that we'll talk about a little bit later, what happens is we might find ourselves in a situation where a colleague is still not satisfied, and as it turns out, employee satisfaction is actually a key component of better business results. So employee not being satisfied when we haven't applied cultural competence in its best way. What I like to do now is I want you, as you keep thinking about the impact of our diversity differences, our dimensions of diversity, and our differences, and the tension that sometimes cause. I want you to think of this scenario. If two individuals came to work together and they liked each other, which means that they get along, they are both motivated to do the work, and they are both competent in doing the work. So they like each other, they're motivated, and they're competent. Thinking, is that a good formula for them to successfully work well together? So I want you to keep that thought in your mind as you view this video scenario that we'll share, called The Giraffe and the Elephant.
In a small community, a giraffe designed and built a new and exquisite home, especially for his family's needs. It was a home ideally suited for giraffes, with high windows that ensured maximum light and good views, while protecting the family's privacy. It had magnificent soaring ceilings, tall, stately doorways, and elegant, narrow hallways that saved valuable space without compromising convenience. The home was so wonderful, it even won the National Giraffe Home of the Year award. The giraffe enjoyed the home and went as far as to move his prestigious woodworking business into the home's spacious basement. Of course, the giraffe would settle for nothing less than a state-of-the-art workshop. So remarkable and advanced was the equipment in this shop, and so skilled a craftsman was the giraffe, that the giraffe's business quickly became the talk of the woodworking industry.
Oh, he's the best. No, I thought everything he owed about that.
Unfortunately, the giraffe's growing popularity began to take its toll, and it became very difficult to keep up with mounting orders. Most days, it was all the giraffe could do to take a break or steal a breath of fresh air.
I'll never get all this work done on time. I could lose clients.
But it was during one brief break that the giraffe happened to notice another well-known craftsman strolling down the street.
I know that elephant. We worked together building a play area for the elementary school last year. He's smart, organized, and an excellent woodworker. I wonder if the elephant would work with me. I need somebody to help me, someone skilled that I can depend on. Hello, elephant. Good day to you. If you have some time, would you like to come in? There's something I'd like to discuss.
Oh, yes, it would be my pleasure, Giraffe.
The elephant was delighted with the invitation. He had enjoyed working with the giraffe in the past, had heard of Giraffe's wood shop, and liked the idea of getting to know the giraffe better.
Well, come in. Come in.
Well, thank you. I've always wanted to see your home and workshop.
But when the elephant tried to enter, he immediately encountered a problem.
This doorway, the doorway's a bit, I believe I'm stuck.
Oh, dear. It's a good thing I put this doorway on double hinges. It's so I can bring in my equipment. This'll just take a moment. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Giraffe.
Soon, the two acquaintances were happily exchanging woodworking stories, and their appreciation of each other's skill grew by leaps and bounds.
Oh, that's wonderful, Elephant. Beautifully done.
This equipment sure makes it easy.
It was obvious that they got along very well. So well, in fact, that the Giraffe offered the Elephant a partnership on the spot. The Elephant quickly accepted. Work with the Giraffe would not only elevate his status in the industry, but would clearly increase his income.
Honey, telephone.
Coming! Oh, excuse me. I better take that in my den.
Oh, of course. Well, I guess I'll get started.
That would be great. My workspace is now your workspace.
Left alone, the Elephant looked around and noticed a room full of raw wood.
Say, I'll bet there's some more cherry wood in there.
So he decided to investigate.
Uh-oh. This is not good. I'd better tell Giraffe. Oh. Oh, no.
The Elephant was very frustrated.
Good heavens, Elephant. What happened? Are you all right?
I'm very sorry, Giraffe. I was trying to get right to work and,
Oh, I see the problem. That door was too narrow again. I guess we'll have to make you more flexible.
What?
Well, you know, there's an aerobic studio near here. I bet if you took some classes...
Do it, wanna do it, feel the burn, wanna do it.
Well, they do a lot of stretching and exercising. If we can get you to do a lot of that stretching part, maybe we can elongate your body.
Yeah, well, maybe...
Obviously, the stairs are too weak to hold your weight. If you go to a ballet class at night...
Now up on those toes like a butterfly. Up, up.
I'm sure we could get you lighter on your feet.
But Giraffe...
Then you'll be able to walk right up those steps. Oh, I know you like the classes because I like you and really need you here.
The Elephant thought long and hard before answering.
You know, Giraffe, well, I was looking forward to being here, and I want to work with you, but, well, to tell you the truth, I don't think a giraffe house is ever going to work for an elephant.
The Giraffe and Elephant faced some intriguing diversity questions. Is this relationship worth pursuing? If so, what are the implications? Could the Giraffe have been better prepared when he opened his door to the Elephant? Were the Elephant's expectations realistic? Why did the Giraffe focus only on changing the Elephant? Should the Elephant go to aerobics class? Ballet class? Complex issues with no easy answers. Yet each must decide how to respond. How would you respond?
All right, thank you for watching that. As you see, the Giraffe and Elephant, if you think back to those three questions that I was asking earlier, if they liked each other, were they motivated, and were they both competent? The response is yes, they liked each other. They were motivated. They were competent. Were they productive in working together? No. So it sounds like that formula of liking each other, motivated, and being competent is a great formula to work well together. As it turns out, when we have mismanagement, I would call it, of differences, when we're not showing the level of cultural competency that we have available to us, we can, even in the best case scenario of liking each other, being motivated, and having competency, we can find ourselves in a diversely tense situation that creates barriers for us to be able to work well together. So let's examine it a little bit further using the analogy of the giraffe and elephant. The first thing is to better understand the roles that we play when we're in the role of a giraffe or when we're in the role of an elephant. And from what we gained from this video scenario here, I would suggest that being in the role of a giraffe is when you know your expectations of working with someone is that they're going to fit into your world and make things more comfortable for you, or fit into your comfort zone to make it easier for you. Now, the giraffe didn't have bad intentions when he invited the elephant in. In fact, he had every good intention of bringing the elephant in and having a good conversation with him to see if they could work together. And the initial part was, yeah, let's get this partnership. The challenging part was the impact of his behaviors when it came time to address the differences in the elephant and how to manage the differences. The giraffe's suggestion was simply that the elephant become more giraffe-like. And if you can, I'm sure you can imagine when someone says, "Hey, just be like me to make this thing work better for me," that can create some tension for us. So that's when, if you find yourself saying, "Be like me to make this thing more easier for me," that may be an indication that you are playing out a giraffe moment. Now, what about an elephant moment? What about being in an elephant role? When we are in the role of the elephant, it's when we are the ones being asked to make changes, make adjustments, not so much to fit requirements, but more so to fit and succeed in the organization by meeting someone's preferences that typically don't have much to do at all with meeting the objectives of the organization or meeting my own objectives, what we're trying to accomplish in the organization. So, as an example, in a giraffe and elephant scenario, aerobics and ballet, as suggested by the giraffe for the elephant to change, aerobics and ballet, those were not solutions that would have those were not solutions to get more wood. The objective was to get to the wood so that the elephant could show his full potential and do his job. The suggestions by the giraffe to do aerobics and ballet was not meeting the objective of getting to the wood. It was meeting the objective of becoming more giraffe-like to get to the wood. And so that's where the tension became unsurmountable, because they couldn't get out of their own individual lenses and see it from another perspective. If I were a giraffe and I would see from the perspective of the elephant that aerobics and ballet, hey, as much, 6 months down the road, even if the elephant were to do aerobics and ballet, he's still going to be an elephant. The size and the weight of an elephant are core identities. We said earlier that for the most part, core identities, primary dimensions. For the most part, primary dimensions are unchangeable. So when someone says, hey, change an unchangeable to make me more comfortable, that enhances the tension that I'm going to experience. And even if it is a changeable, if it's not necessary to change that or flex that to meet the objectives, again, it's going to create tension for me. My diet is not a primary dimension, but if someone were to say, hey, just go to Morton Steakhouse and eat a prime rib to keep us all comfortable in our decision of where we're going to go eat, Daryl, that's going to create a lot of tension in me, because it's not going to happen, first of all. Just an example. So we get from the giraffe and elephant scenarios that when we find ourselves in these diversity tense moments, we are going to play either role. We might either be in the role of the giraffe, or we're saying, hey, change, or we might find ourselves in the role of the elephant, where someone is saying to us, hey, you change. Regardless, it's going to create a little bit of challenge for us. And if you think back to the tension dimensions that you identified a little bit earlier, I want you to especially use them in the context of the workplace. In that, take one of those tension dimensions that you identified, and thinking about what does it take to fit and succeed in the environments in which you're operating in, environments in which you're working in. Are you the giraffe, or are you the elephant in those moments of tension? Take one of those situations, and and sometimes we might be some people say a girelephant. It kind of depends upon which way I turn in the scenario. Middle level management roles are sometimes that way. If you are a provider and an administrator at your facility, that might be a situation where in the administrator role you might find yourself in the eyes of many people, a giraffe. At the provider role, you might find yourself in your own eyes as an elephant, depending upon the situation. So, again, how does that tension, how do those tension dimensions play out for you in those scenarios? And the other thing I would invite you to think about is, if you were to take one particular situation that is creating some tension for you right now or recently in your work experience, and list out what you think is necessary to have quality interpersonal relationships with the people that you're working with. You can use a particular scenario to kind of get your thoughts triggered and start listing out the things that you need for folks to make you have what I call a happy day. I mean, is it, people smiling at you the right way or shaking your hand the right way when you come into the clinic? Or is it people speaking the language that you prefer and the accent that you prefer? Or is it, talking about the shows that you watched last night? Whatever it is, whatever that list is, just start thinking about that list and jotting things down. What do you need to make things work well for you and have a happy day with the people that you're working with? And I'm talking colleagues, I'm talking customers, patients that you and people that you're interacting with within the community as well. And as you're making that list, let me continue on, because what we learn from the conversation with the giraffe and elephant and from our tension dimensions is that with diversity, we're going to get some diversity tension. Now, we typically look at tension as being a bad thing when we are stressed. That feels bad. When we are anxious, that feels bad. But tension doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Tension might come even in the form of excitement. Excitement doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I mean, if anyone, as an example, likes roller coasters, I love roller coasters. That that's a level of excitement that is great for me, but it's also tense for me. That the bigger that first hill, as we're going up that hill, the more tense. But at the end of that big first hill, for a person like me who likes roller coasters, the bigger the hill, the better the ride. But I was tense in the moment. For someone like my wife who doesn't like roller coasters, doesn't even like to watch me and my little daughter on the roller coaster, she doesn't even want to watch us. She's like, oh, no, not at all. She wouldn't even get on a baby roller coaster when we were just at Disney on Sunday. So, for her, that's a bad thing. So I'm pointing this out because we want to stop looking at tension in and of itself as being a bad or a negative thing, especially when it comes to experiencing diversity tension. Because when we're experiencing diversity tension, we tend to want to run away from situations. We tend to want to maybe move that person to another department, to get them away from me, but put them on someone else. Hey, I've got just the person for you. He's great, kind of thing. I'm going to suggest that instead of running away from tension, we become more skilled at responding to diversity tension. And that is that second component of cultural competency, of knowing how you show up. How do I respond to diversity tension? So let's talk a little bit more about that, give you some tips, and then we'll get some questions going on how you can apply some of these tips to your own work experiences. So the reality is that we do sign up for tension by the mere fact that we decide we are going to work with somebody. We decided we're going to interact with someone. By default, that means we're going to experience differences because there's no one out there that's exactly like you. So the question is, again, how well are you going to manage the differences that you experience? One way that this shows up is, as we see in the giraffe and elephant, as we see in our own diversity situations, oftentimes we have this intent and impact gap. The giraffe had great intentions that we talked about, but the impact of his behaviors on the elephant, not so great. So intent and impact, if I'm the doer of the deed or the sender of information, the thing that I absolutely know for sure of these two elements is intent. I can make assumptions on impact, but what I absolutely know for sure as a sender is intent. The receiver absolutely knows for sure impact. Now, oftentimes when the impact is an insensitivity, we make the assumption that the intent was bad because what we felt was bad. And that's going to create some even more diversity and tension. So knowing that sender knows intent, receiver knows impact, and in real life these are very often quite different, we have to examine what creates the gap between the two. And we're in the suggestion that what creates the gap is our own personal filters or lenses. Our life experiences make up our filters. Our core identities that we talked about earlier make up our filters. So what this model tells us is that the exact same situation might have completely different outcomes depending upon the lenses that interpreted the situation. That's why if you've ever been in a meeting and you're walking out of the meeting and your colleague got something completely different from what the speaker said versus what you got, because you are looking at it through different lenses. Or if you've ever read an email and you're thinking, wow, what are they talking about? Why are they going off on me? And you forward that email to someone else and they respond by saying, what are you talking about? They're not going off on you. Those are lenses playing out. I'll give you a perfect example. I'll take one sentence. This sentence is, I didn't say she stole the book. That's the sentence. Now, one person might read it as saying, I didn't say she stole the book, which implies that someone else said she stole the book. Another person might read it and say, I didn't say she stole the book, which might imply someone else stole the book. Another person might read it and say, I didn't say she stole the book, which might imply she stole something else. Again, same sentence, completely different interpretation because of the lenses that it goes through. And this is happening every day, every minute of the day, as we are experiencing colleagues, patients, people in the community, friends, family, kids in the house, whatever have you. So we want to start closing the gap on the intent versus impact, and I'll give you a couple of tips on that in a moment. Because ultimately what will happen is, as we experience tension through gaps in intent versus impact, through just challenging differences that we experience, we get into this, what I call the dance, right? The dance of tension, the dance where we are pointing fingers at one another, blaming the other person for the situation. The elephant is blaming the giraffe, and the giraffe is blaming the elephant. And in reality, as we know, we have three fingers pointing back at ourselves to remind us of our role in the dance. What am I going to do differently in this situation? That's the value of those three fingers pointing right back at me. So what I want to do then is I want to start peeling back the layer and identify what is that underlying issue that's creating the tension for me. Go back to giraffe and elephant. The underlying issue, is it that the elephant is a bad guy or that the giraffe is a bad guy? No. The underlying issue is getting to the wood in order to meet the objectives. That's it. That's what we have to address. There are probably some assumptions and beliefs on both parts. Peeling back the layer and identifying what those assumptions and beliefs can be very valuable, because that can help to expose my own stuff, the challenges that I'm having with this person. So what we want to do then is, as we peel back the layers and start to identify what the real deal is, that helps us to choose a different dance. And the reason I like to use the dance analogy is, if you've ever dancing with someone and they're stepping all on your toes and you don't like the way that they're dancing, maybe, whatever it is, however they're dancing, you could either keep dancing with them, keep getting frustrated, or you could simply dance differently. And they may follow or they may not. But you're going to control the situation from your perspective. It's kind of like if you are on the phone with someone and they're screaming and yelling and hollering at you. Ever gonna try this one? Just put the phone down. Right? You no longer have to engage in that screaming, hollering, and yelling. Just put the phone down, and then you pick it up every now and then and see if they're still yelling. And of course, if you haven't responded in a while, they're going to stop screaming and yelling because you've chosen a different dance, regardless of what they've done. And that's the beauty of this concept is I can, any point in time, I can stop pointing my finger and blaming you and choose my role and my understanding and my accountability in this conflict situation. So let's look at some tips to do that. First and foremost, realize that with differences, we get diversity tension. It is what it is, right? Now, we also know that tension is not a bad thing. So it's not so much the diversity tension that's creating the challenge. It's our response to the tension that creates the outcome. If you want a different outcome, it's about choosing a different dance. And part of choosing a different dance is differentiating between one's intention and the impact on me in our relationship interactions. And both sender and receiver can, in fact, help to close the gap between intent and impact. The sender can close the gap by simply checking in on the receipt of what you delivered and learning the receiver's come from. What do I mean by that? If I'm speaking at a meeting, or if I'm running the meeting, and I start to see people, do some reaction like, "Oh my gosh, what is this guy doing?" Even nonverbal clues, hand over the head, or talking to another neighbor sitting next to them, like, "You believe what he just said?" If I see that behavior going on, that's my opportunity to stop the process, stop the conversation, and just check in and simply say, I call it a woo-woo moment. We'll say, "Woo-woo, obviously I've said something that had a bad impact. Please let me clarify," or "What did you get from what I said?" and then providing some clarification. Available to us. Some of us may do it already. Some of us may do it regularly. Many of us probably don't do it enough. The other the other way that we close the gap is from the receiver's end. The receiver can close the gap by simply when the impact is an insensitivity. I kind of lead in with this one mantra that my mentor told me years ago in this work, and that is, consider the possibility that most insensitivities are unintentional. So as a receiver, that's kind of what I go by in life. And I just earlier today, doing some volunteer work out in the community, trying to manage the differences in a situation. Both individuals were in that situation. Both individuals had completely different perspectives on what went down in the situation. And my main way of facilitating that conversation was talking intent and impact. Sharing with the doer of the deed, I get your intention, but your potential impact was this. And kind of, because I understand that it's not the bad impact was your intention, and I'm leading through that to have that conversation. So if I lead in with what I felt, that insensitivity that I felt was intended, I will not have the conversation to close the gap with a colleague. If I lead in with that insensitivity that I felt was not intentional, that will lead me to get more information. And that's really what this is all about. Sender closing the gap by getting more data, understanding how the person that I'm talking to or interacting with a lot of times needs to receive it. That is closing the gap. Receiver closing the gap by considering the possibility that most sensitivity unintentional. That is, again, getting more information. So both are trying to get more information in our lenses, in our to help us decrease the challenge decrease the gap between intent and impact. Remember, we said that regardless of what the other person does, I can stop pointing my finger. Of course, if both stop pointing their fingers and we, come together like this as opposed to like this, come together and hand in hand as opposed to fist, we have an opportunity to really address diversity attention and respond to it in a more productive manner. It requires some what we call diversity maturity. As Dr. Robin, who used to be way years ago, used to be on Oprah, she'd like to say, we need to show up as a grown-up. And I love that term, showing up as a grown-up, to remind us to show some diversity attention in choosing that different dance. A couple more things to consider. Most conflict that we are experiencing is a result of some expectation that someone did not meet. And most of us, if we go back to that list that I suggested that you come up with, the things that you need to have your happy day, well, that's the list that we're walking around with on a daily basis. And we're holding people to that list. The challenge is, the longer that list is, the fewer people we're going to be happy with, because no one's going to meet our very long list. I like to call it, I equate it to what I call the choice of being single. When I was in between marriages, I had a long list of what my mate needed to meet in order for me to be happy. Until I realized that the longer my list was, the longer I was going to be by myself. So as I started to pare that list down to what was absolutely essential for a productive relationship, guess what happened? My mate showed up. And as it turned out, it was great. It's been great. It's been challenging, of course, but lowering my list now, do I try to pull my list out every now and then on my mate? Absolutely. And she reminds me that she didn't meet that list back then and she's not going to meet that list today. So let's go back to the workplace. When we are walking into the workplace, holding people to this very long list, shake my hand a certain way, look at the movie I would look, talk about the show I watched last night, talk about the game I watched last night, and do this, all these things that we're holding folks to, and have your hair a certain way, and don't wear this, and don't wear that, and don't wear this piercing, and all of these things that we're holding folks to that may or may not have anything to do with meeting the objectives of the job. We need to hold people to the absolute essentials that we need to meet the objectives of the job. That's it. And that list gets very, very short. And that's a list that you may have a conversation about when you get back to the workplace and start talking about, what are our absolute requirements, and start to differentiate those from these preferences that we like to have. And when someone starts talking about, well, I don't like my cousin, she was interviewing for a physician position to fill at her clinic that she was managing. And she called me up and she was like, Daryl, this guy, he's great on paper. This guy is fantastic. But it was just something about him that I didn't like. I told my cousin, I said, what's going on there is that he's violating your personal preference. The next question was, is violation of your personal preference grounds for not hiring this individual? And she had to get to the point where she answered the question, no, it's not. I've got to focus back to, does he meet the requirements of the job? And that's what drove her to actually suggesting that the position get hired on board. And the position turned out great. Did she have to work with her own diversity attention with the physician? Absolutely. But the impact of that physician on providing patient care was fantastic. Take ownership. Take ownership for my role in the dance. That's about peeling back the layers a little bit differently and saying, this person that I'm experiencing tension with, what am I ultimately believing about this person? what's driving my my challenge with this individual, especially when they don't meet some expectation. Because when someone doesn't meet those expectations, I start to come up with some ideas in my head about why they didn't meet the expectation. Oh, yes, because they're old. It's because they're young. It's because they're from this community. It's because from their community. It's because they didn't speak, proper English. And it's because whatever. I start pulling up all of these diversity things, pulling up all the cards, so to speak, and the beliefs that I have about that particular difference. And I've got to really address that and say, how am I playing out these beliefs in my actions toward the individual? And then I've got to say, I'm going to do something differently. I'm going to move beyond my comfort zone, get some more information on this individual, maybe some way establish a different kind of relationship with them, go out to lunch with them to get some more information on them. And not saying information to intel against them, more so information to get to know them in a different way, so that my lenses, otherwise tainted towards them, become much clearer towards them and what they can do for how we work together to provide great patient care. That's what it was about. That's what we mean by choosing that different dance. So as we move towards cultural competence, we want to value the differences that people are bringing to the table by meeting them where they are and seeking validity in the different perspectives that everyone has to offer. Does that mean that we're going to embrace every difference that people bring into the workplace? No. But it does mean that we will differentiate those differences, and those differences that add value to our ability to get the job done, to providing great patient care, those are the differences that we're going to embrace, integrate, and utilize. Most of the other differences don't have an impact, and we're simply just going to learn how to manage those. Understand how we show up, and understand and challenge my beliefs and assumptions and expectations when I find myself in conflict with someone or with some diversity tension with someone in the workplace. So value and understand with compassion. That's about listening with the willingness to be influenced. If I'm going to engage in the conversation to help close the gap between intent and impact, as an example, I need to show up with the ability to be influenced by the information that my colleague is going to share, that patient is going to share. When the receptionist learned of the need to not suggest a date, but merely ask about possible dates, that adaptability and flexibility happened because that receptionist was willing to be influenced by a new way or a different way of making appointments. And they got better results as an example, as a result. So I'm going to conclude my formal portion and say thank you. These are ways in which you can reach me, and we're going to open
And at this time, if you would like to ask a question, press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that is star 1 to ask a question. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. And there are no questions at this time.
Just want to make sure no one else has a question before we conclude tonight. Are there any other questions?
Again, that is star 1.
So no one has a burning question? Does anyone have a burning question about a situation that's going on right now in their workplace, and they got a colleague that is getting on your last nerve, and you want to say, Daryl, how do I apply what you just talked about? Because people always walk up to me after the fact and say, I got one. So.
And there are no questions at this time.
Well, let's see. There's a question that, is this something that someone wrote? Oh, how do I take this back to my agency to make a difference in the culture? Great question. Okay, so A couple of tips. One thing is terminology, right? So you can start using terminology that will simply get people to think differently. Terminology like preferences versus requirements. So if someone is getting hung up on, well, I don't know, well, I'll give you another example. There was an African American patient who made a complaint about two Latina nurses who were speaking in Spanish in the exam room. And the African American patient made the complaint saying that they thought that the nurses should only speak Spanish. Well, my response to that situation simply is this: what's the requirement? What's the preference? If the requirement is to speak in a way in which the patient understands when speaking to the patient, then you may have a requirement of, when talking to the patient, you speak in English. But when talking to each other, what was playing out there is that patient was having a moment of infusing her preference on the situation, because the two individuals turn towards each other and start talking to each other, and probably talk to each other in their comfort zone language. So using the terminology, is there a requirement for them to turn to each other and talk to each other in English, or is there a requirement for them to turn to each other and talk to each other in a way that helps them understand each other as best as possible in that moment? If that's the requirement for them to communicate, to help each other understand each other, to whatever it is, go get the item that needs to be gotten out of the locked cabinet, I need to talk to you in a way that I understand you. So, and I always take that back to, if I were in Germany and my German is a little bit challenged, it's never going to sound like the German's German. But if another colleague comes in from America, and when we're talking to each other, we're probably going to speak to each other in English, because that helps us to quickly understand each other. When we turn around and talk to our German colleagues, we're going to speak to them in our form of German. It's not going to be the best German, and I hope that they would, be patient with me. So using the terminology, that's how one way you can take that back to your agency. In terms of using, preferences, are we making decisions on preferences, or are we making decisions on requirements? I hope that helps. All right, we have another question from Lisa, and this is, let's see, I work in an environment where there is a great deal of ethnocentrism. All undesirable behavior, problems, rudeness, unfairness is attributed to historical trauma. This is very stressful and makes it almost impossible to make changes in the environment. Do you have any suggestions? I try to be tolerant, patient, and understanding, but it is really getting to me. Great. All right. So, I'm going to make the assumption that by ethnocentrism, you're simply saying that, my ethnicity is better than your ethnicity, and that kind of thing, and all the tension that comes with ethnocentrism. And the challenge is, it sounds like there's some historical challenge associated with that. My suggestion in these types of environments is focusing again on goals and getting people to understand that there may be an opportunity in this environment to get an understanding of differences, cultural differences. That might just come about by having some activities that help us to gain more awareness of the value of the different ethnic cultures that are in your work environment. Because sometimes, that whole "I'm better than you are" kind of thing is playing out because someone has felt slighted in the past slighted of their culture. So when environments give people an opportunity to celebrate their cultures, and across the board in a very inclusive way, sometimes that eases the tension of, I don't get to celebrate my culture in this environment, and you provide a platform to celebrate cultures. to get us to better understand each other and get to an environment where then we can work better together. What you don't want to do, though, is you don't want celebration of cultures to become the diversity strategy for the environment. Celebrating of cultures is part of diversity strategy, and that's the understanding differences part, but there's also the work environment differences part. So if we take giraffe and elephant as an example, I would say that, you know, giraffe and elephant having a cultural celebration moment or a cultural awareness moment of, you know, hey giraffe, I'm an elephant, aerobics and ballet, not going to make me any smaller, not going to make me lighter on my feet. Let me explain that to you, da da da, whatever have you. That's that part of, but ultimately they had to get to creating an environment where both could fit and succeed. So talking about and understanding each other's differences is a part of it. Making some adjustments to the house is another part of it, which means we have to start looking at what are our policies and practices inside of the organization that are making people tense and getting in the way of us more effectively working together in the giraffe and elephant scenario to get to the woods. So in this case, they were going to ultimately need to widen some doorways and reinforce some stairways so that we not only fit in the door, but actually succeed in the hallways. And that's what you ultimately want to do in that environment. And you're going to have to probably find an advocate that will that's going to be willing to make some of those adjustments. I don't know if that.
Do you have any other questions?
And then no questions over the phone lines.
Let's see. We've got something from Marine here. A relatively new tension that seems to have been introduced is with the implementation of EHRs with older physicians who do not type well, are not used to looking things up on the internet, and now having to be more actively involved in billing and coding. What insights can you provide? Yeah, so that's where adaptability and acceptance comes in terms of those older physicians. I don't know. When I'm with clients, I simply say this: the ship is moving in a different sail. Or the train has left the station. If you want to get on the train, this is the train of technology at this point. Organizations are on a train of technology. If you want to stay on the train, you're going to have to become accepting and adaptable to the new ways of doing things. The flip side of that, though, is that the organizations, again, have to provide the support for those folks who need to make some change and need to change well outside of their comfort zone. So you've got to have the support there from the organizational standpoint, and you've got to have the motivation from somewhere to flex your adaptability and acceptance for this new way of doing things. But bottom line is, the train has left the station. Are you going to hop on that train of technology or not? That's the new requirement, and that's one of the challenges. So it's because some of those physicians might say, this is not the environment that I signed up for. The challenge there is that in most of our environments, the requirements will change. And so using this technology has changed the requirement, and they're not comfortable with that. And I get that.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, well, we'd like to thank all the participants for asking the questions, and thanks to you, Mr. Butler, and all the NHSC webinar participants. At this time, we'd like to ask you to take a moment to fill out the on-screen evaluation. Your opinion will help us further develop these webinars. Again, thank you for participating tonight, and have a good evening.